If you're like me, then you love the look of an awesome wide angle photo. And in this video, I want to take you through some tips to get the most out of any wide angle. We're talking distortion, perspective, elements, composition, right through to editing, so we can take your wide angle photos from ordinary to awesome. Now for a wide lens, I use the Canon EFS 10-18mm. This is a cheap and affordable wide angle lens for Canon APS-C cameras and gives an equivalent angle of view to what a 16-25mm would give on a full frame camera. In case you didn't know, a wide focal length is measured between 24 and 35mm, compared to the 8-24mm focal length, which is classed as an ultra wide angle lens. A wide angle lens will create a massive amount of distortion, namely barrel distortion. This happens because the field of view is so much wider than the image sensor, and that image needs to be squeezed to fit onto the sensor in your camera. That squeeze causes straight lines to curve inwards, and it happens especially towards the edges of the frame. Why am I telling you this? Distortion has a bit of a bad reputation with photographers, and sometimes, even though it's not always wanted, it can be used to your advantage. Tip number one is to understand how and when to use barrel distortion. To minimize the amount of distortion in a photo, the easiest thing to do is to keep your camera level and perpendicular to your subject. You can, however, use this distortion by tilting your camera off its horizontal axis. This can really exaggerate parts of an image. If you were shooting a building and you pointed your camera up at it using a wide angle lens, the bottom of that building is going to look massive compared to the top, giving that building a really epic, tall feeling. Same goes if you've got something in the foreground. You can tilt your camera down and use that distortion to make the scene in front of you bigger and more dramatic. Alongside barrel distortion, you have another type of distortion happening all the time as well. In this example, the railing down the side looks a lot bigger in the foreground and leads off into the distance. This is caused by perspective distortion, and it is completely different from barrel distortion. Perspective distortion is simple. If you were to take an SD card and pull it really close to your eye, it's going to look massive compared to, say, the big screen TV in the background. This is what happens with a photo. And with a wide angle lens, this is really emphasized. You can use this to your advantage by placing your subject at varying distances from your lens. For example, if you wanted to exaggerate a part of a subject, you could get them to move, say, their hand closer to the lens, and it's going to look so much bigger than the rest of them. You could place them further into the scene and let the perspective feel a little bit more natural. This comes with a warning though. If you place, say, a person really close to the lens and to the edge, you're going to get some interesting images. Adding elements to your wide angle photos is a really easy way to create layers and interest in your photos. If I'm out shooting street photos, I'm going to be shooting over railings, I'm going to be shooting through plants, trees, fences, anything I can get in the foreground, and maybe using that perspective tip from earlier to exaggerate or fit in certain parts of that image. When you're using foreground elements, if you have any lines leading into the distance, when you look through your wide angle lens, those lines are going to converge, and that's a really cool, interesting way to frame, say, a subject in the background. Those lines are the reason that people use wide angle lenses for those look-up shots, because any straight lines are going to converge and it makes the image just look way more dramatic and cool. Tip number 4 might seem simple, but it's to use the width that a wide angle lens gives you. Now it's obvious to say, and I'm very guilty of this too, but I see a lot of wide angle shots that are really busy and really hectic, and they don't always need to be. That sometimes having space in an image is a really good way to isolate your subject and kind of give you a minimalist vibe. Very different, really cool. You can also use this width in your advantage when it comes to things like panning shots. Panning shots are really tough at the best of times, but the longer that focal length, the harder it is. So using a wide angle shot to blur a massive amount of the image and keep your subject in focus is going to look really cool. Tip number 5 is to do with editing. Now sometimes you'll go out and you'll take a wide angle photo and you don't necessarily want the distortion. This is where this handy little tab in Lightroom comes in, the geometry tab. Now in here you can easily correct those curved lines without losing too much of the frame. If you've kept your camera fairly horizontal and perpendicular to your scene or subject, then you're going to have to do minimal amount of editing here. My go-tos are to hit the auto setting, see what it does, hit the full setting, see what that does, and if neither of them look quite right, I'll use the guided section to actually guide the lines into place and straighten the photo for me. Obviously, if you want the distorted look and it's part of the creative look that you're going for, don't even worry about it. Just leave it. It looks cool. We're breezy. So I use these 5 tips all of the time when I'm out shooting. Speaking of being out shooting, this video here is me going out shooting with a wide angle lens. So if you want to see this stuff in real time, in action, this is the place to see it. Right here. I'll just wait.